In the harsh frontier of 1870s Wyoming territory, young Eleanor Whitfield finds herself used as collateral in her father's desperate land deal with ruthless cattle baron Marcus Blackwood. When her father trades her hand in marriage for a valuable stretch of grazing land, Eleanor believes her fate is sealed. However, everything changes when she meets Jake Sullivan, a principled cowboy working on Blackwood's ranch who sees her true worth beyond any transaction. As Eleanor navigates the brutal realities of frontier life, she must find the courage to claim her own destiny, while Jake risks everything to prove that some things, especially love and human dignity, are worth more than all the gold and land in the West. The autumn wind swept across the Wyoming territory with a bitter cold that seemed to cut straight through to the bone. Eleanor Whitfield pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the kitchen window of their small homestead, watching the endless expanse of golden prairie grass bend and sway in the harsh gusts. At 19, she had grown accustomed to the isolation and hardship of frontier life, but today something felt different. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching winter storm. Her father, Samuel Whitfield, sat hunched over the rough-hewn kitchen table, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he signed document after document. The papers were spread before him like a deck of cards dealt by fate itself, and Eleanor could see the defeat written across his lined face. Samuel had once been a proud man, full of dreams about making a fortune in the gold fields of California before settling down to build a cattle empire in Wyoming. Now, at 52, those dreams had crumbled into dust as dry as the summer drought that had devastated their small herd. "Papa, what are those papers?" What?" Eleanor asked, though something deep in her stomach told her she didn't want to know the answer. Samuel looked up, and she saw tears glistening in his gray eyes. "Eleanor, darling, come sit with me. We need to talk." She moved slowly across the cabin's single room, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden planks. The fire in the stone hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the log walls that had been their home for the past 5 years. Everything about this place spoke of struggle and sacrifice, from the patched curtains her mother had sewn before the fever took her 3 years ago, to the table Samuel had built with his own hands when they first arrived with nothing but hope and determination. Eleanor sat down across from her father, folding her hands in her lap the way her mother had taught her. "Papa, you're scaring me." Samuel reached across the table and took her hands in his calloused ones. "Daughter, I've made arrangements for your future, for both our futures." "What kind of arrangements?" "Marcus Blackwood owns the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He's got more land than any man has a right to, and more cattle than you could count in a lifetime. He's been wanting to expand his grazing territory, and our land sits right in the middle of what he needs." Eleanor felt her heart beginning to race. "Our land? Papa, this is our home." "Was our home," Samuel corrected gently. "I've sold it to Blackwood. The drought killed most of our cattle, and we owe more money than we could make in 10 good years. Blackwood's offer was generous." "Where will we go?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "I'll be going to work for my brother in Colorado. Mining work. It's no life for a young woman. Then I'll come with you. I don't care how hard it is." "Eleanor," Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper, "you're going to stay here, as Mrs. Marcus Blackwood." The words hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor jerked her hands away from her father's and stood up so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor. "You sold me. I arranged a marriage that will give you security and comfort for the rest of your life. Blackwood is wealthy beyond measure. You'll never want for anything, except love, except choice, except the right to decide my own fate." Eleanor's voice was rising, but she didn't care. "How could you do this to me, Papa? How could you trade me like a piece of livestock?" Samuel stood up as well, his own voice growing heated. "Because I love you, Eleanor. Because I'm dying inside knowing that I've failed you and your mother's memory. Because winter is coming and we have nothing. No food, no money, no prospects. At least this way, you'll survive. You don't know Marcus Blackwood like I do." Eleanor had heard the stories in town, about Blackwood's ruthless business practices, about the way he treated his workers, about the 2 previous wives who had died under mysterious circumstances. "He's not a good man, Papa. He's a powerful man. And power is what you need to survive out here." Eleanor turned away from her father and stared out the window again. In the distance, she could see a rider approaching through the golden grass followed by a wagon. Even from this distance, she could tell it was an expensive outfit, the kind that belonged to someone with money and influence. Her heart sank as she realized this must be Marcus Blackwood himself. coming to collect his purchase. "He's here," she whispered. Samuel joined her at the window, and together they watched as the small procession drew closer. The lead rider was a tall man in a black coat and hat, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in command. Behind him came a covered wagon driven by another man, this one younger and wearing the practical clothes of a working cowboy. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something," Samuel said quietly. "This marriage contract isn't just about land. Blackwood has agreed to pay off all our debts and give me enough money to start fresh in Colorado. Without this arrangement, I'd probably end up in debtor's prison and you'd end up, well, I don't like to think about what would happen to you." Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to imagine her mother's face, tried to think about what Sarah Whitfield would have wanted for her daughter. Her mother had been a strong woman who had followed her husband across half the continent to build a new life. But she had also been a woman who believed in love and dignity and treating people with respect. "Did you at least negotiate any terms for me?" Eleanor asked. "What do you mean? Did you ask him to treat me kindly? Did you ask him to give me time to adjust? Did you ask him about his expectations?" Samuel's silence was answer enough. The sound of horses approaching grew louder, and Eleanor could hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather saddles. She took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of strength her mother had passed down to her. If she was going to face this new life, she would face it with dignity. "I need you to promise me something, Papa," she said. "Anything. Promise me that you'll write. Promise me that you'll let me know where you are and how you're doing. Promise me that if I need you, you'll come." Samuel's voice was thick with emotion. "I promise, darling girl. I promise." The riders had reached the cabin now, and Eleanor could hear boots hitting the ground outside. She smoothed down her simple brown dress and checked that her hair was properly pinned up. Whatever Marcus Blackwood expected from this arrangement, she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her as a broken, defeated woman. A heavy knock echoed through the cabin, and Samuel called out, "Come in!" The door swung open, and Marcus Blackwood stepped inside. Eleanor's first impression was of a man who took up more space than his physical body should have allowed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His clothes were expensive but practical, the outfit of a man who had money but also did real work. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Behind him came the cowboy from the wagon, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. This second man was younger, probably close to her own age, with sun-streaked brown hair and warm hazel eyes. Where Blackwood radiated power and control, this man seemed to carry himself with a quiet strength that spoke of integrity and genuine goodness. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Eleanor felt something pass between them. A recognition, perhaps, or a moment of understanding. "Samuel," Blackwood said, extending his hand. "I trust everything is in order." "Yes, sir. Papers are all signed and ready." Samuel shook Blackwood's hand, but Eleanor could see the shame in her father's posture. Blackwood's gaze moved to Eleanor, and she felt as though she were being appraised like a horse at market. "Miss Whitfield, I am Marcus Blackwood, and I am pleased to make your acquaintance." Eleanor inclined her head slightly but did not speak. She was determined not to make this easy for anyone. "This is Jake Sullivan," Blackwood continued, gesturing to the younger man. "He's one of my ranch hands and will be helping with the transition." Jake stepped forward and tipped his hat. "Miss Whitfield, I'm honored to meet you." There was something in his voice, a warmth and respect that was completely absent from Blackwood's tone, that made Eleanor look at him more closely. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She would not go quietly into this new life, and she would remember that not all men were like Marcus Blackwood. Like this video if you're enjoying Eleanor's journey. Subscribe for more stories of courage from the American frontier, and comment below to let us know where you're watching from. The silence that followed Jake Sullivan's introduction stretched uncomfortably through the small cabin. Eleanor could feel the weight of her new reality settling around her like a heavy cloak, but she refused to let it show on her face. She had been raised to be strong, and strength was what this situation would require above all else. "The wedding will take place in 3 days, Blackwood announced as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "I've arranged for Reverend McKinnon to come out from Cheyenne. He's performed many ceremonies for prominent families in the territory." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. 3 days. She had 3 days to say goodbye to everything she had ever known, and prepare herself for a life tied to a man she had just met and already instinctively distrusted. "That seems awfully fast," Samuel said hesitantly. Perhaps Eleanor could use more time to prepare herself, to gather her things. Blackwood's cold blue eyes fixed on Samuel with the kind of stare that had probably ended many negotiations in his favor. Time is a luxury we cannot afford, Samuel. Winter approaches, and I have cattle drives to organize and business matters to attend to. The ceremony will be simple but proper, and afterward Eleanor will take her place as mistress of the Double Bar Ranch. What about my belongings? Eleanor asked, speaking for the first time since the introductions. My mother's things? Bring whatever you wish, Blackwood replied, though his tone suggested he considered it a minor inconvenience. Jake will return tomorrow with a wagon to collect you and your possessions. Jake had been standing quietly near the door, his hat in his hands, but now he stepped forward. Ma'am, if you'd like, I could help you pack your mother's more delicate items. I've got experience handling fragile things during transport. There was something in his offer that touched Eleanor deeply, not just the practical help but the recognition that her mother's belongings were precious to her, that they deserved careful treatment. It was the first moment since this nightmare began that anyone had shown consideration for her feelings. That's very kind of you, Mr. Sullivan, she said, and saw something warm flicker in his hazel eyes. Blackwood seemed impatient with this exchange. Fine, Jake. You'll handle the logistics of the move. Now, Samuel, about the final payment. As the two older men moved to the table to discuss money, Eleanor found herself standing awkwardly in the middle of the room with Jake. She was acutely aware of his presence, the way he held himself with quiet confidence, the fact that his clothes were well worn but clean and carefully mended, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work. Miss Whitfield, he said quietly, stepping closer so their conversation wouldn't be overheard. I want you to know that not everyone at the Double Bar Ranch shares Mr. Blackwood's approach to things. Eleanor studied his face, trying to understand what he was really telling her. What do you mean? I mean that there are good people working there. People who believe in treating others with respect and kindness. People who will look out for you. Including you? Jake met her gaze directly. Yes, ma'am. Including me. It was a simple statement, but Eleanor felt as though he had just thrown her a lifeline in a stormy sea. She didn't know why this stranger would offer her his protection, but something in his manner convinced her that his word could be trusted. Why? She asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, glancing over at Blackwood and her father, who were still deep in their financial discussion. Because every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of the circumstances that brought them to where they are. And because, he paused, seeming to search for the right words, because I've seen what happens when powerful men think they own everything and everyone around them. It's not right. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. Mr. Sullivan, may I ask you something? Of course. Do you think there's any way out of this arrangement? Jake's expression grew troubled. Ma'am, I wish I could give you an easy answer to that question. The truth is, out here, legal contracts and social expectations carry a lot of weight. But I also believe that every person has the right to choose their own path, even when the choices are limited. That's not really an answer. No, ma'am, it's not. But it's honest. Eleanor appreciated his honesty more than she could express. In a world where her father had just traded her future for land and money, and where a stranger expected her to marry him in 3 days, Jake Sullivan's straightforward truthfulness was like finding water in a desert. Miss Eleanor, Samuel called from the table. Come here, please. She walked over to where the two men stood, noticing that a leather pouch heavy with coins now sat on the table next to the signed papers. The sight of it made her stomach turn, the physical representation of what her father considered her worth. Mr. Blackwood has been generous enough to advance you some money for a proper wedding dress, Samuel said, holding out several bills. He wants you to go into town tomorrow and purchase whatever you need. Eleanor looked at the money in her father's outstretched hand and felt a wave of rebellion wash over her. I have a dress. Eleanor, be reasonable, Samuel said. This is your wedding day we're talking about. No, Papa. This is a business transaction we're talking about. Let's not pretend it's anything more than that. Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. Young lady, you would do well to remember that you are about to become my wife. I expect a certain level of cooperation. Eleanor felt Jake tense beside her, though he didn't move or speak. She lifted her chin and met Blackwood's stare directly. Mr. Blackwood, you may have purchased my hand in marriage, but you have not purchased my spirit. I will fulfill the terms of this agreement because I gave my word, but I will do so on my own terms. For a moment the cabin was so quiet that Eleanor could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the log walls. Blackwood's face had turned red, and she could see a vein pulsing in his temple. Samuel looked terrified, probably imagining Blackwood backing out of the deal entirely. Then surprisingly, Blackwood laughed, a cold, calculating sound. You have spirit, I'll give you that. Very well. Wear whatever dress you please. But understand this, Miss Whitfield. Spirit is all well and good in a wife, but defiance will not be tolerated. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, but she held her ground. I understand perfectly, Mr. Blackwood. Good. Blackwood turned to Jake. Sullivan, you'll collect Miss Whitfield tomorrow afternoon. Make sure she's ready. Yes, sir, Jake replied. But Eleanor noticed that his voice had taken on a careful, neutral tone that suggested he was working hard to control his own reactions to what he had just witnessed. Blackwood gathered up the papers from the table and headed toward the door. Samuel, pleasure doing business with you. Miss Whitfield, I look forward to welcoming you to your new home. As soon as the door closed behind him, Samuel sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. Eleanor, what were you thinking? You can't talk to a man like Blackwood that way. Why not, Papa? What's the worst he can do to me? Break off this arrangement. That would be the best thing that could happen. You don't understand the position we're in. If Blackwood changes his mind, then we'll figure something else out, Eleanor said firmly. We always have before. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. There was no other option, no other way out of the desperate situation her father had created. Tomorrow, Jake Sullivan would come to collect her and her belongings, and in 3 days she would marry Marcus Blackwood. The only question was whether she would do it as a broken woman, or as someone who still had fight left in her. As if reading her thoughts, Jake appeared in the doorway. Miss Whitfield? I wanted to make sure you knew. Whatever you need tomorrow, whatever help you require, you just have to ask. Eleanor looked at this young man who seemed determined to be kind to her in spite of everything, and felt a spark of something she hadn't expected. Hope. Eleanor spent that night lying awake in her small bed, staring at the rough wooden ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie wind. Tomorrow, Jake Sullivan would arrive to collect her and her belongings, and her life in this modest cabin would come to an end. She tried to memorize every detail, the way moonlight filtered through the threadbare curtains her mother had sewn, the creak of the floorboards beneath her father's restless pacing in the next room, the distant call of a night bird somewhere in the darkness. When dawn finally broke, Eleanor rose and began the process of packing her life into wooden crates and cloth bundles. She handled each of her mother's possessions with reverence, the delicate china tea set that had traveled from Boston, the quilts stitched with careful hands during long winter evenings, the leather-bound journal filled with her mother's thoughts and recipes. Each item told a story, held a memory, and Eleanor couldn't bear to leave any of them behind. Samuel emerged from his room looking haggard and older than his 53 years. The weight of what he had done seemed to have settled on his shoulders overnight, bending them under a burden of guilt and regret that no amount of money could lift. Eleanor, he said quietly, I want you to know that I never wanted things to turn out this way. Eleanor continued folding her mother's winter coat, not trusting herself to look at her father's face. But you did it anyway. I had no choice. The bank was going to foreclose next month. We would have lost everything. The land, the cabin, everything your mother and I built together. At least this way you'll have security, a future. Whose future, Papa? Mine, or the one you've imagined for me? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. I pray that someday you'll understand that I thought I was doing what was best for you. Eleanor finally turned to face him and saw that tears were running down his weathered cheeks. Despite her anger and hurt, she felt her heart soften slightly. Her father was a weak man, perhaps, but not a cruel one. He was simply a man who had found himself in an impossible situation and had made the only choice he could see. I do understand, Papa, she said softly. I just wish you had talked to me about it first. We might have found another way. What other way? I've been over it 1,000 times in my mind, and I can't see any other path forward. Before Eleanor could respond, they heard the sound of wagon wheels approaching. Through the window, she could see Jake Sullivan driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 well-cared-for horses. He had arrived early, and something about his punctuality and the neat appearance of his equipment spoke well of his character. Eleanor smoothed her dark blue dress, the nicest one she owned, and checked her reflection in her mother's small mirror. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her green eyes looked larger than usual in her pale face. She looked like what she was, a young woman trying to face an uncertain future with as much dignity as she could muster. Jake knocked on the door with 3 measured raps, and Samuel opened it to reveal the cowboy standing on their small porch. He had cleaned up since yesterday. His brown hair was freshly combed, his face recently shaved, and his clothes, while still clearly work clothes, were his best ones. Good morning, Mr. Whitfield, Miss Whitfield, he said, removing his hat. I hope I'm not too early. Not at all, Eleanor replied. I'm nearly ready. Jake's eyes swept over the crates and bundles that filled the small room. That's quite a bit to transport. No worries, though. I brought a large wagon and some extra blankets to cushion the more delicate items. For the next hour, Jake proved himself to be a man of his word. He handled Eleanor's mother's china with the care of someone moving priceless treasures, wrapping each piece in cloth before nestling it securely in the wagon. He listened patiently as Eleanor explained which items were most fragile, and he asked thoughtful questions about the best way to pack the more awkward pieces. Samuel helped where he could, but Eleanor could see that every item loaded into the wagon felt like another nail in the coffin of his relationship with his daughter. When they reached her mother's rocking chair, the chair where Eleanor had been rocked to sleep as a baby, and where she had later sat reading countless books, Samuel's composure finally cracked. Martha loved that chair, he whispered, running his hands over the smooth wooden arms. She used to sit there in the evenings, sewing or knitting, humming little songs. Eleanor felt her own eyes fill with tears. I know, Papa. I'll take good care of it. Jake, who had been respectfully silent during this exchange, stepped forward. Mr. Whitfield, if you'd like, I could secure the chair so that it rides as smoothly as possible. Rocking chairs can be tricky to transport, but I've done it before. Thank you, Samuel said gratefully. That would mean a great deal. As Jake carefully loaded the rocking chair, Eleanor gathered the last of her personal belongings, her books, her sewing supplies, and the small wooden box that contained her mother's jewelry. The jewelry wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but each piece held precious memories. There was the simple gold wedding band her mother had worn for 25 years, the cameo brooch that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, and the string of pearls that Samuel had saved months to buy for Martha's birthday. Is there anything else? Jake asked, surveying the now nearly empty cabin. Eleanor looked around one final time. The cabin that had been her entire world now seemed smaller and shabbier than she remembered, but it was still home. It was still the place where her mother had taught her to read, where she had learned to cook and sew, where she had dreamed about her future and wondered what lay beyond the prairie horizon. No, she said quietly. I think that's everything. Samuel walked out to the wagon with them, moving slowly like a man much older than his years. When they reached the wagon, he pulled Eleanor aside for a private moment. I've written a letter to your Aunt Margaret in Denver, he said, pressing a folded paper into her hands. If you ever need somewhere to go, someone to turn to, she would welcome you. I've told her about the situation. Eleanor looked down at the letter, understanding what her father was really saying. He was giving her an escape route, a way out if life with Marcus Blackwood became unbearable. It was perhaps the most thoughtful thing he had done in this entire ordeal. Thank you, Papa, she said, tucking the letter carefully into her reticule. Samuel embraced her then, holding her tightly against his chest. I love you, Eleanor. Whatever happens, please remember that. I love you too, Papa. Jake helped Eleanor up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they began to move away from the cabin, Eleanor turned for one last look at the place where she had grown up. Samuel stood in the doorway, one hand raised in farewell, looking small and alone and older than she had ever seen him. Take your time looking, Jake said gently. We're in no hurry. Eleanor was grateful for his understanding. How far is it to the Double Bar Ranch? About 2 hours by wagon. It's good riding country. You'll see some beautiful scenery along the way. Mr. Sullivan, may I ask you something personal? Of course. How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood? Jake was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a particularly rough patch of ground. About 3 years now. I needed work, and he offered good wages. What's he like as an employer? Demanding. Expects things done his way, no questions asked. But he pays fairly and on time, which is more than you can say for some ranchers in these parts. Eleanor sensed there was more he wasn't saying. But, Jake glanced at her, then back at the road ahead. But I think you've already gotten a sense of his character, Miss Whitfield. He's a man who's used to getting what he wants when he wants it. It wasn't exactly the reassurance Eleanor had been hoping for, but she appreciated his honesty. As the wagon rolled across the vast prairie toward her new life, she found herself grateful that Jake Sullivan would be there. Whatever challenges lay ahead at the Double Bar Ranch, at least she wouldn't face them entirely alone. The journey to the Double Bar Ranch unfolded across a landscape that took Eleanor's breath away. Rolling hills stretched endlessly in every direction, covered in golden prairie grass that swayed like ocean waves in the constant wind. Occasional stands of cottonwood trees marked the presence of creeks and streams, their leaves already beginning to turn yellow with the approach of autumn. It was beautiful and vast and utterly overwhelming to someone who had spent her entire life within a few miles of one small cabin. Jake proved to be an excellent traveling companion. He pointed out landmarks and wildlife along the way, sharing stories about the history of the territory and the various ranches they passed. His knowledge of the land was impressive. He could identify different types of grass, predict weather changes from the behavior of birds, and navigate by reading the subtle variations in the landscape that Eleanor would never have noticed. "That's the Henderson spread over there," he said, gesturing toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. "Good people, the Hendersons. They've got 3 daughters about your age. I suspect you'll meet them at church services." Eleanor felt a spark of hope at the mention of other young women nearby. The isolation of her new life had been one of her greatest fears, and knowing that there were potential friends within reach was reassuring. "How often are church services held?" she asked. "Every other Sunday when the circuit preacher can make it out this far. Weather permitting, of course. Winter can make travel impossible for weeks at a time." As they crested a hill, Jake pulled the wagon to a stop and pointed ahead. "There it is, Miss Whitfield, the Double Bar Ranch." Eleanor's first sight of her new home left her speechless. The ranch was far larger and more elaborate than anything she had imagined. The main house was a 2-story structure built of stone and timber, with a wide covered porch that wrapped around the front and sides. It was clearly the home of a wealthy man, with glass windows, painted trim, and even what appeared to be decorative shutters. Surrounding the house were numerous outbuildings, barns, stables, bunkhouses, and storage sheds, all in excellent repair and organized with military precision. "It's enormous," Eleanor breathed. "Mr. Blackwood employs about 20 men year-round," Jake explained, "more during cattle drives and branding season. The Double Bar is one of the largest operations in this part of Wyoming territory." As they approached the main house, Eleanor could see people emerging from various buildings to watch their arrival. Cowboys paused in their work to tip their hats respectfully, and she caught glimpses of women in aprons who must have been household staff. The attention made her acutely aware of her simple dress and modest belongings, and she found herself unconsciously straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin. Jake brought the wagon to a stop in front of the main house, just as Marcus Blackwood stepped onto the porch. He was dressed in expensive clothes, a tailored vest, polished boots, and a gold watch chain that caught the afternoon sunlight. Everything about his appearance spoke of wealth and authority, from his perfectly groomed mustache to the way he carried himself with absolute confidence. "Miss Whitfield," he said, descending the porch steps with measured strides, "welcome to your new home." Eleanor accepted Jake's hand as he helped her down from the wagon, grateful for the steadying touch. Her legs felt unsteady after the long ride, but she was determined not to show any weakness in front of Blackwood. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. It's a very impressive property. The largest ranch in the county," Blackwood said with obvious pride. "Over 50,000 acres of prime grazing land, 5,000 head of cattle, and some of the finest quarter horses in the territory." Before Eleanor could respond, an older woman emerged from the house. She was probably in her late 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her dress was plain but well-made, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had run a large household for many years. "Miss Whitfield, this is Mrs. Patterson, my housekeeper," Blackwood said. "She'll help you get settled and explain how things are managed here." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward and gave Eleanor a brief curtsy. "Welcome to the Double Bar Ranch, miss. I've prepared the guest room for you until after the wedding." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, that's very thoughtful." Eleanor noticed that the housekeeper's expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away about her thoughts on the upcoming marriage or Eleanor's presence at the ranch. It was the look of someone who had learned to keep her opinions to herself in a household where the master's word was law. "Jake, see that Miss Whitfield's belongings are brought to her room," Blackwood ordered. "Carefully now. Some of those items look delicate." "Yes, sir," Jake replied, already moving toward the back of the wagon. As Jake began unloading her possessions, Eleanor was struck by the contrast between the two men. Blackwood stood with his arms crossed, supervising but not participating, while Jake handled each item with the same care he had shown during the packing. When he lifted out her mother's rocking chair, Eleanor saw him pause for just a moment, running his hand over the smooth wood, with something that looked like appreciation for the craftsmanship. "Mrs. Patterson will show you to your room and help you unpack," Blackwood said. "We'll dine at 7 o'clock sharp. I prefer punctuality in all things." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood." Mrs. Patterson led Eleanor into the house, and she was immediately struck by the opulence of the interior. The floors were polished hardwood covered with expensive rugs. The furniture was heavy and ornate, and the walls were decorated with oil paintings and mounted hunting trophies. It was the home of a man who wanted everyone to know exactly how successful he was. "This way, Mrs. Patterson said, leading Eleanor up a grand staircase to the second floor. "I've put you in the blue room. It has a nice view of the garden and catches the morning light." The guest room was larger than the entire main room of Eleanor's former home. It was furnished with a four-poster bed, a mahogany wardrobe, a writing desk, and two comfortable chairs positioned near tall windows that looked out over a carefully maintained flower garden. It was beautiful and comfortable, but it felt as foreign to Eleanor as a palace. "It's lovely," Eleanor said, though something in her voice must have betrayed her feelings. Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment, then closed the door behind them. "Miss Whitfield, may I speak plainly?" "Please do. I've been managing this household for 15 years since Mr. Blackwood's first wife passed away. I've seen a lot of changes come and go, and I've learned when to speak up and when to hold my tongue." Eleanor waited, sensing that the older woman was choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Blackwood is a demanding man with very particular expectations about how his household should be run. He values order, punctuality, and obedience above all else. If you understand that and conduct yourself accordingly, you'll find life here quite comfortable. And if I don't?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew troubled. "Then I suspect you'll find it quite difficult indeed." There was something in the housekeeper's tone that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. She was beginning to understand that Marcus Blackwood's wealth and power came with a dark side that she was only just beginning to glimpse. "Mrs. Patterson, may I ask what happened to Mr. Blackwood's first wife?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment, then walked to the window and looked out at the garden. "She died in childbirth, miss. Both she and the baby. It was a terrible tragedy that changed Mr. Blackwood greatly." Eleanor felt a stab of sympathy for the man she was to marry, followed immediately by a wave of fear. If having a wife and child had once softened Marcus Blackwood, losing them had clearly hardened him into the cold, controlling man she had met. "I see," Eleanor said quietly. Mrs. Patterson turned back to face her. "Miss Whitfield, I want you to know that if you ever need anything, advice, assistance, or just someone to talk to, you can come to me. This house can be a lonely place, especially for a young woman far from family." It was a kind offer, and Eleanor was grateful for it, but as she looked around the luxurious room that would be her temporary home until she became Mrs. Marcus Blackwood, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was going to need more than Mrs. Patterson's kindness to survive what lay ahead. Outside her window she could see Jake carefully carrying her mother's rocking chair toward the house, and she found herself wishing desperately that his steady presence would be available to her in the difficult days to come. Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking her belongings with Mrs. Patterson's help. The older woman proved to be efficient and surprisingly gentle as she handled Eleanor's mother's possessions, treating each item with the respect of someone who understood their sentimental value. When they came to the jewelry box, Mrs. Patterson paused to admire the delicate woodwork. "This is beautiful craftsmanship," she said. "Was it made by someone in your family?" "My grandfather made it for my grandmother as a wedding gift," Eleanor replied. "He was a carpenter back in Ohio before they moved west. It's clear he was a skilled man. The dovetail joints are perfect, and look at the smoothness of this finish." Eleanor was touched by the housekeeper's appreciation for the simple piece. In a house filled with expensive furniture and elaborate decorations, her grandmother's modest jewelry box seemed almost shabby by comparison, but Mrs. Patterson's admiration reminded her that true craftsmanship and love were worth more than mere wealth. As they arranged Eleanor's books on the writing desk, Mrs. Patterson noticed the titles with interest. "You're quite well read for someone so young. Mr. Blackwood has an extensive library. Perhaps you'd enjoy exploring it. Does Mr. Blackwood read much himself?" Mrs. Patterson's expression became carefully neutral again. "He reads newspapers and cattle market reports primarily. Business correspondence takes up most of his time." Eleanor sensed there was more the housekeeper wasn't saying, but before she could probe further, a bell rang somewhere in the house. "That's the dinner bell," Mrs. Patterson explained. "You have about 30 minutes to prepare. Mr. Blackwood expects everyone to be punctual, and he dresses formally for evening meals." After Mrs. Patterson left, Eleanor stood before the large mirror in her room and examined her reflection critically. Her dark blue dress was the finest she owned, but it was clearly the garment of a farmer's daughter, not the wife of a wealthy rancher. The fabric was sturdy rather than elegant, and while it was clean and well mended, it lacked the sophistication that Marcus Blackwood would undoubtedly expect from his future bride. She pinned her mother's cameo brooch to the collar of her dress and arranged her hair as elegantly as she could manage. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She had learned long ago that confidence could make up for a multitude of material shortcomings. When Eleanor made her way downstairs, she found Marcus Blackwood waiting in what appeared to be a formal sitting room. He had changed into an impeccably tailored black suit with a crisp white shirt and elegant cufflinks. Everything about his appearance reinforced his image as a man of wealth and influence. "Miss Whitfield," he said, rising from his chair, "you look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You have a beautiful home. I'm glad you appreciate it. I've worked hard to build something worthy of my position in this territory." He gestured toward a sideboard laden with cut crystal decanters. "May I offer you a sherry before dinner?" "That would be nice, thank you." Blackwood poured the sherry into delicate glasses that probably cost more than Eleanor's father made in a month. As he handed her the glass, his fingers brushed against hers, and she had to resist the urge to pull her hand away. "I thought this evening we might discuss our future arrangements," Blackwood said, settling into his chair with his own glass. "The wedding is planned for next month, which gives us time to address any concerns you might have." Eleanor sipped her sherry, grateful for something to do with her hands. "What kind of concerns?" "Your role as mistress of this household, for one thing. It's a position that comes with significant responsibilities. You'll be expected to manage the domestic staff, oversee social obligations, and represent the Blackwood name in the community with appropriate dignity." The way he spoke made it clear that these weren't suggestions or possibilities to be discussed, but requirements that he expected her to fulfill without question. "I've never managed a household this large," Eleanor admitted. "At home it was just my father and me, and we lived very simply. Mrs. Patterson will help you learn the necessary skills. She's quite competent, though she'll naturally defer to your authority as my wife." Eleanor noticed that he spoke of their marriage as if it were already a foregone conclusion, with no acknowledgement that she might have thoughts or feelings about the arrangement. "Mr. Blackwood, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why did you choose to acquire a wife this way? Surely a man of your position could have married any number of women through more conventional means." Blackwood's expression darkened slightly, and Eleanor wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. "Conventional courtship is time-consuming and uncertain," he said after a moment. "I prefer business arrangements that are clear and straightforward. Your father needed money, and I needed a wife who understood that marriage is a practical partnership rather than a romantic fantasy." His blunt assessment stung, even though Eleanor had expected nothing different. Still, hearing him reduce their future marriage to a mere business transaction was sobering. "I see. And what do you expect from this practical partnership?" "I expect a wife who will manage my household efficiently, represent my interests in the community, and provide me with sons to carry on the Blackwood name. In return, you'll have security, comfort, and a position of respect in the territory." Sons. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had known, of course, that children would be expected, but hearing him state it so baldly made the reality of her situation hit home with new force. Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is served, Mr. Blackwood." The dining room was as impressive as the rest of the house, with a long mahogany table that could easily seat 12 people, an enormous chandelier that cast warm light over fine china and crystal, and oil paintings of pastoral scenes that probably cost more than most people's homes. Tonight only 2 places were set, one at the head of the table and one to its right. Blackwood seated Eleanor with formal courtesy, then took his place at the head of the table. The meal was elaborate by Eleanor's standards: roast beef with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Everything was perfectly prepared and elegantly served, but Eleanor found it difficult to enjoy the food under Blackwood's watchful gaze. "Tell me about your education, Miss Whitfield," he said as they ate. "What subjects did you study?" "My mother taught me to read and write, and I've read extensively on my own. I can do basic mathematics, and I know some history and geography from books." "Can you play piano, speak French, paint watercolors?" Eleanor shook her head. "We couldn't afford those kinds of lessons, but I can cook, sew, manage accounts, and I know a great deal about gardening and preserving food." "Practical skills," Blackwood mused. "Good. I have no use for a wife who is merely decorative." The comment was clearly meant as a compliment, but something in his tone made Eleanor feel as if she were being evaluated like livestock at a market. She was beginning to understand that Marcus Blackwood saw everything and everyone in terms of their usefulness to him. "What about you, Mr. Blackwood? How did you come to own such a large ranch?" "I started with nothing 20 years ago, and built this empire through hard work and smart business decisions." I bought land when others thought it was worthless, invested in cattle when the market was low, and eliminated competition through superior planning and execution. The way he said eliminated competition sent another chill down Eleanor's spine. She was beginning to understand that Marcus Blackwood was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, regardless of the cost to others. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself thinking about Jake Sullivan and wondering what he was doing. Was he eating in the bunkhouse with the other cowboys? Did he ever sit at this grand table? Or was he relegated to the servants' quarters despite his obvious intelligence and education? "You seem distracted, Miss Whitfield," Blackwood observed. "Is something troubling you?" "I was just thinking about how different this all is from what I'm used to," Eleanor replied honestly. "You'll adapt. Change is never easy, but I'm confident you'll learn to appreciate the advantages of your new position." After dinner, Blackwood escorted Eleanor back to the sitting room, where he poured himself a brandy and offered her another sherry. As they sat in the elegant room surrounded by expensive furniture and artwork, Eleanor felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. "I think I'll retire early tonight," she said finally. "It's been a long day. Of course, Mrs. Patterson will wake you at 7 tomorrow morning. I like to begin each day early." As Eleanor made her way upstairs to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just had a glimpse of what the rest of her life would be like. Formal, controlled, and utterly devoid of warmth or genuine affection. In her room, she sat in her mother's rocking chair and looked out at the vast prairie beyond her window, wondering if somewhere out there, Jake Sullivan was looking at the same stars and thinking about the young woman whose life had just taken such a dramatic turn. Eleanor spent her first week at the Double Bar Ranch learning the routines and expectations of her new life. Mrs. Patterson proved to be an invaluable guide, teaching her the complex schedules that governed the household and introducing her to the various staff members who kept the ranch running smoothly. Each day followed the same rigid pattern: breakfast at 7, household management until noon, lunch at 1, afternoon activities approved by Blackwood, and formal dinner at 7. Despite the luxury surrounding her, Eleanor felt increasingly trapped. Blackwood monitored her activities closely, questioning her about how she spent her time and expressing disapproval whenever she strayed from his preferred routines. When she asked to visit the stables to see the horses, he informed her that the barn was no place for a lady. When she offered to help Mrs. Patterson with the cooking, he reminded her that manual labor was beneath the dignity of his future wife. It was during her second week that Eleanor discovered the truth about Blackwood's first wife. She had been exploring the house when she found a locked room on the second floor. Mrs. Patterson found her standing in front of the door, trying the handle. "That was Mrs. Blackwood's room," the housekeeper said quietly. "Mr. Blackwood keeps it exactly as it was when she died. May I see it?" Mrs. Patterson glanced around nervously, then produced a key from her apron. "Just for a moment. He's in town on business, but he could return at any time." The room was like a shrine to a woman Eleanor would never meet. Everything was preserved in perfect condition: clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, personal items arranged on the dressing table, even flowers that were regularly replaced to maintain the illusion that the room's occupant might return at any moment. But what caught Eleanor's attention were the books scattered around the room, many of them lying open as if someone had been reading multiple volumes simultaneously. "She loved to read," Mrs. Patterson said, noticing Eleanor's interest. "Poetry, novels, philosophy. She read everything she could get her hands on." Eleanor picked up a volume of Whitman's poetry and found notes written in the margins in a delicate feminine hand. The previous Mrs. Blackwood had been an intelligent, thoughtful woman with strong opinions about literature and life. "What was she like?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. She was spirited when she first arrived, full of ideas and enthusiasm. She wanted to start a school for the ranch children, organize community events, improve conditions for the workers. What happened to those plans? Mr. Blackwood discouraged her efforts. He said a wife's place was in the home, not meddling in community affairs. Gradually, she stopped making suggestions and spent more time alone with her books. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. She was seeing her own future in the story of Blackwood's first wife, an intelligent woman slowly crushed by isolation and a controlling husband. "Mrs. Patterson, how did she really die?" The housekeeper's face went pale. "In childbirth, just as I told you." "But there's more to the story, isn't there?" After another long silence, Mrs. Patterson spoke in barely above a whisper. She was terrified of having children. She had difficult pregnancies before, 2 miscarriages that nearly killed her. When she became pregnant the final time, She begged Mr. Blackwood to let her go to Denver where there were proper doctors. He refused, saying the local doctor was adequate. Eleanor felt sick. And the labor went on for 2 days. She was screaming for help, begging for someone to take her to Denver, but Mr. Blackwood wouldn't allow it. He said women had been having babies without doctors for thousands of years, and his wife would manage just fine. The horror of the story hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Blackwood had essentially sentenced his wife to death through his stubborn refusal to seek proper medical care. "We need to leave this room," Mrs. Patterson said urgently. "If he finds us here." That afternoon, Eleanor walked to the stables despite Blackwood's prohibition. She needed air, space, and time to think about what she had learned. She found Jake grooming a beautiful chestnut mare, his movements gentle and patient as he worked. "Miss Whitfield," he said, looking up in surprise, "you shouldn't be here. If Mr. Blackwood finds out—" "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. What kind of man is Marcus Blackwood?" Jake's hands stilled on the horse's flank. "That's not my place to say, miss. Please. I'm going to marry him in 2 weeks, and I need to know what I'm facing." Jake looked around to make sure they were alone, then met her eyes directly. "He's a hard man, Miss Whitfield. Harder than you can imagine. He sees people as possessions to be controlled, not human beings with their own thoughts and feelings. Mrs. Patterson told me about his first wife." Jake's expression darkened. "That poor woman. She deserved so much better than what she got. Jake, I can't marry him. I can't live the way she lived, and I won't die the way she died." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need to leave. Tonight. Before the wedding. Before I'm trapped here forever." Jake stared at her for a long moment. "Miss Whitfield, he'll come after you. And your father. My father made his choice when he sold me to pay his debts. Now, I have to make mine. Where would you go? You have no money, no family except your father." Eleanor had been thinking about this all afternoon. "There's a teacher shortage in Colorado Territory. I saw an advertisement in one of Mr. Blackwood's newspapers. They're offering positions to unmarried women with basic education. It's dangerous to travel alone, especially for a woman." "Then don't let me travel alone." Jake's eyes widened as he understood what she was asking. "Miss Whitfield." "Jake, I know you don't owe me anything, but I also know you're a good man who wouldn't want to see an innocent woman destroyed. Help me get away from here, and I'll never ask anything else of you." Jake was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, he spoke. "There's a wagon train leaving from Cheyenne next week, headed for Denver. If we left tonight, we could reach Cheyenne by morning, and you could join them." "We? You're right that it's dangerous for a woman to travel alone. I'll see you safely to Cheyenne, then decide what to do with my own life." Eleanor felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "Thank you, Jake. I'll never forget this kindness. Go pack whatever you can carry in one bag. Meet me at the old oak tree by the creek at midnight. And Miss Whitfield, once we leave here, there's no going back. Make sure this is really what you want." Eleanor spent the evening packing carefully, choosing only the most essential items and her mother's most precious belongings. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Patterson, thanking her for her kindness and asking her to give Marcus Blackwood a message that she refused to become another casualty of his need to control and possess. At midnight, she slipped out of the house and made her way to the oak tree, where Jake was waiting with 2 horses and supplies for the journey. As they rode away from the Double Bar Ranch under a sky full of stars, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The journey to Cheyenne was difficult but not impossible, and Jake proved to be as reliable and protective as Eleanor had hoped. When they reached the town, she was able to join a wagon train headed to Colorado, where she eventually found work as a school teacher in a small mountain community. 6 months later, Eleanor received a letter from Mrs. Patterson, informing her that Jake had started his own small ranch with money he had saved over the years. Marcus Blackwood had raged about their departure for weeks, but eventually moved on to pursue another mail-order bride. Eleanor never regretted her decision to leave. She had chosen freedom over security, uncertainty over control, and in doing so, had discovered a strength within herself that she never knew existed. As she stood in front of her classroom each morning, teaching children to read and write and think for themselves, she knew she had found exactly where she belonged. The end.